let's jump right in to the Antigone. What's the major theme here? What is this versus this? I would say there's a this versus this. Look, we're in 5th century Athens. I already gave you guys a bunch of history leading you up to this moment where democracy is still every bit an experiment. It's by no means proven yet. And so there's a lot of tension between this idea of a sovereign people running things themselves, yet at the same time having a history where kings ruled everything. And then there was this slow process leading up to democracy, the quotes around it, for reasons we got into before. So this whole question of, is something right simply because we have agreed to live under what Rousseau would later call a social contract, or Locke as well, a social contract necessarily, does that mean that what the king who has either been appointed or elected, almost always appointed, inherited the rule over the people, is it necessarily right simply because that person is in power? Or can what the king decides be overridden by anything? And if so, what? And it seems that, and this is at least the way that the play is usually interpreted, that Sophocles has an answer, and that is, yeah, there is something that goes above what the dictates of the king, and that is God's law, the law of religion, the law of the Olympians, because that overrides even kings. Because kings are nothing but imitators of gods. It's never the other way around in the ancient world. Quite often kings will do all they can, in Athens as well, to convince the populace that they not only should be associated with the Olympians, but even in some cases were descendants of the gods. Think about Theseus, okay? Literally, historically, a king of Athens, yet at the same time, a full-fledged, one of the 4 most important pre-Homeric heroes. Okay, yet he's also a king. So you have this interesting kind of ambiguity between kings and gods when it comes to the power vested in kings, supposedly by divine right. And that leads all the way up into, very famously, say, pre-revolutionary France with Louis XIV, considering himself, l'état c'est moi, the state, I am the state, pretty much calling himself the sun king, right? So that stuff didn't stop with the Greeks or the Romans, and so that's the main, kind of bubbling cauldron of this play, is that Creon, now the acting king of Thebes, is insisting upon Polynices not being buried because he's perceived to be the enemy, despite the fact that he's the brother, right, of his niece. Are you catching with it's kind of a little bit confusing genealogy, but not too bad. And so that's really the underlying tension of the play. And then from there, all kinds of interesting dynamics arise. And so there are theories when you get into how, why it was that Sophocles introduced a third actor after Aeschylus and brought in a second. There are theories that it's, at least in great part, due to the dynamics going on between characters in the Antigone in particular, because you have some really important 3-way interactions going on. Now, there's the most. Does anybody know the most famous part of this play, Antigone? Anybody know the one that, for whatever reason, and you may or may not agree that it deserves to be considered famous, but there's one part that is quoted by far more often than in the other part of the Antigone. Anybody know what it is? Would it surprise you if I told you that it was one of the choruses? Okay, how about those choruses, right? The choruses in Antigone are probably the most famous of all the extant Greek tragedies, and choruses from the Greek tragedies. And there's one, that one, nothing is more amazing than human beings. Remember that part? 368 or so. Okay, check it out. Let's look into this, and you guys tell me what you think the significance of this chorus is. About 368 or so, line 368. It's the chorus that says, "Many are the wonders, none is more wonderful than what is man." By the way, the original is human being, not man. Aner means man. The idea here is that you're cataloging a bunch of aspects of what human beings have achieved. But are we supposed to take it as nothing but straightforward and literal? That, wow, human beings are just awesome. How should we maybe be taking it? Is there a word for that? One word used often for this chorus is irony. Okay, yet another instance of irony, not quite as much tragic irony as a kind of just a more pure form of irony. Yeah, I mean, this is the best we got, and it ain't so great, maybe. Yeah, I mean, that's how it's taken. It's taken, it's purely ironic as opposed to literally. Whereas, I don't know, long time, hundreds of years ago, in England, this was taken more literally and more just on face value. Human beings are so great, and it was used quite often as a quote, from the ancient Greeks about their perspective on how great human beings are, believe it or not. So different ages will look at different passages from these great works differently. The very idea of human beings being able to have the power to rule over themselves in a democracy and in effect to usurp the role of the king implies that the human beings take upon themselves the sort of associations with the gods that kings formerly did. Okay? And so there's that ambiguity involved in the Antigone as well, this idea that you're not only questioning whether it's the God's law versus human law, but also human law that is imbued in the very idea of getting its authority and sovereignty from the gods. That's where it gets really tricky. That was one of the things that was going wrong about society, was democracy. The idea that, no, it's a failed experiment, time to go back to the king, time to go back to the experts who will run things in a way that is more proper than is going on now. And so, at least according to Plato, Socrates was kind of the symbol of the breakdown of democracy. And in our times, every once in a while, Socrates is brought up within the context of debates about social justice and various things like that. Okay, so I'm not getting into politics in this class, but every once in a while that stuff's brought up in connection with, the Antigone, I would say, more than any other play by Sophocles. Okay, let's jump. So that's it's an important chorus, mainly to get across the idea of we human beings think we're all that, but really, at least we should call that into question. It's a very interesting topic, this idea of intergenerational power, because in ancient Greece, the idea that a kid would stand up to his father, especially the father's king, in that manner, would be seen as just as outrageous and unrealistic as a woman doing what Antigone is doing in the real world. In a real world where women are not only not allowed, is that the word for it? Not only not, who not only don't enact the female roles on the stage, but can't even sit in the theater and watch the men enact the female roles. Okay, so that's as ironic as you can. That's as unrealistic as you can get in the eyes of the ancient Greeks. But a close second would be this idea of the boy standing up to his father in that manner. In our times, that notion is a lot more popular, and I have my theories about why it is. And it's not just my shit, but there's this guy named Neil Postman who wrote a book called The Disappearance of Childhood in the 80s or 90s. And TV was as far as you went with technology at that time, but now with the internet it's even more the case. This idea that as the generations get to where what they are mostly exposed to on a daily basis is common between them, there becomes less of a sense of an initiation to become an adult. Think about that. It's kind of heavy shit if you think about it. So he was saying that with TV. He was saying that the fact that kids are watching the same TV shows that adults are, and he said this in the 80s. I think it was the 80s, maybe early 90s, whatever. That's yeah, things were kind of moving in that direction. But he died before the internet came along, or at least became really popular. And it's even more the case now, to where you have kids mimicking adults in so many ways, on say YouTube, etc. That it's becoming, I think, that this whole idea of adults occupying this high ground that children go to school in order to be able to work up to be a part of is dying off. And as schools become more online, and less in the classroom, like what we have here, that division is going to be even less, less the case. And then you get a lot of, Dr. Phil's with Bad Baby, talking back to him and saying, screw you, just because you're old doesn't mean you know what you're talking about. So it's, why do I bring all this up? It's an example of one of many, many, many topics that we can bring up from these plays that have resonance not only in our own times, not only in the times, as far as we can tell, when the play was performed, but also, if you want to get philosophical about it, have historical relevance throughout the ages that we can pay attention to the best of our ability and make some sense of, and see maybe even where things are going in the future based on what we see. And I think that this is an example of that. You have intergenerational interaction going on between these characters, and the thing that you just said, the thing that you just brought up, may not have been brought up 10, 15 years ago in a classroom, because there was still more, let us say, taken for granted of this idea that you all are almost there. You're almost fully formed adults. Once you have your bachelor degree, then you've made it. Then you're in a full-fledged... That shit is dying out. And now people who are 15, 14, and especially with, learning about those physicist geniuses, 12 years old, running circles around the 70-year-old professors. Who knows where all this is leading to? But this is, these kinds of plays bring these kinds of topics up, and I think it's worth, getting into a little bit. What do you guys think about Antigone and Ismene at the beginning? The movie that you're going to watch deals with it a little differently than the actual words, I think. So what's your impression? Ismene eventually comes around to wanting to help Antigone, but a little bit too late in the eyes of Antigone, or is she sincere in her wish to join in with Antigone, or is it just for appearance sake? What's your impression? How does she fit in? How seriously, if at all, is the audience supposed to take the idea of someone like Antigone actually doing something like what she's doing in the play? And if not, is it pure parody, or is it something in between realism and parody? Or how seriously are we supposed to take Antigone? And if not at all, I wouldn't put it past him to have at least entertained Euripides especially, but him maybe as well, to entertain the possibility that one day things might develop to the point where, I don't know, where women will actually be considered human beings, something like that. There's always the chance that he didn't consider it to be nothing but an ironic joke. Now the question, however, given as far as you guys are able to determine, if you haven't taken a class in this stuff or read books about Greek history, etc., insofar as we've talked a little bit about it, you have a general sense that in that 5th century context, it probably wasn't intended to be taken seriously. The idea of a woman being able to do it. Now, if that's the case, then if you're a 5th century audience member in Athens, how are you supposed to take it? Are you supposed to be laughing? Are you supposed to be scared? Are you supposed to be scared of the idea of somebody, let alone a woman, wielding this kind of power, having this kind of influence? You guys know the difference between allegory and symbolism? That's that one thing that they always teach. Allegory is straightforward. Animal Farm equals, Stalinist Russia. Equals. It's literally straightforward, supposedly at least. supposed to be a direct one-on-one correspondence between, or maybe French or with Napoleon. After all, the pig's name was Napoleon, so maybe with Napoleon. But the point is, a totalitarian state. It's allegory. It's one-on-one, etc. Whereas symbolism, little less predetermined as to what is supposed to equal what, etc. So I think that Asia's getting at that things are a little less allegorical and a little more symbolic, to where there's an open-endedness to how we interpret these things. Why not? Yeah, I mean, that's my feeling. It doesn't feel to me allegorical. It doesn't feel to me where there's supposed to necessarily be just one answer. I think it's supposed to be thought-provoking. I think you're supposed to, be thinking about it, as opposed to just like laughing at what's going on the stage. How ridiculous! What a fantasy this is about women doing this kind of thing that in the real world they can't. There are those who argue that, you guys. You need to know that. There are those who argue that that this was parody and that this is intended to rub salt in the wound of women who not only, according to this opinion, can ever wield this kind of influence in the real world, but also can't even come and see it in the theater, but depend on their husbands to tell them what happened on the stage. So there are those who argue that as well. And it's not only staunch feminists who argue that. There are those on the opposite side of things who also do. So yeah, there's a lot of room for interpretation, and supposedly, at least according to one theory, the more open-ended this kind of stuff is, the richer it is, and the greater it is as literature. Because, as I was kind of intimating earlier, it changes with the times. The way we interpret it is often reflective of the way we see things within the society that we happen to have been born into, as opposed to only from some sort of abstract, universal sense of humanity, in a general sense. So there's that's definitely a question that's asked in terms of what all this means. What's going on with Antigone, with this Mene representing authority, temporal authority. The idea that we agreed to live in this society, and we need to abide by what the king says, and that's just the way it is. Antigone says, no, there is a higher law. Now, by the way, there was a movie made in the 80s, or maybe 90s, but I think the book was written in Stephen King's Misery. Anybody know that? Yeah? Remember that? Right from Antigone. Anybody notice? There's a line, at least in the movie. Okay? There is a higher law. Remember that? Remember that part? At least in the movie. There is a higher law, the law of the gods. It's higher than humans' laws, taken right from Antigone. Stephen King knows his mythology. Every once in a while he'll throw in some mythical stuff, just at least thinly veiled. And that's an example of that, this idea that there's a higher law, etc.